Welcome to Methods Talk, the Methods at Manchester podcast. I'm Professor Emma Bannister, the Director of Methods at Manchester. In this episode, we meet Amir Raki, who is a lecturer in marketing at University of Liverpool, Ilma Chowdhury, who is Senior Lecturer in Marketing, and Judy Zolkiewski, who is Professor of Marketing, both from University of Manchester. Amir, Ilma and Judy have collaborated on a number of research projects focused around the design of services for refugees using principles of engaged scholarship. They also talk in this episode about a workshop they led for Methods at Manchester, which focused on supporting charities and social impact organisations in developing their knowledge around approaches to qualitative analysis. First, I asked them each to say a few words to introduce themselves, starting with Amir.
Thank you, Emma. My name is Amir Raki. I'm a lecturer in marketing at the University of Liverpool Management School. And between 2018 and 2023, I was a PhD student under the supervision of these two excellent supervisors, which we are going to talk more about my PhD studies and the project that I worked on during this podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, for inviting us. I'm a senior lecturer in marketing, and I've been here at MBS since my MSc studies.
Fantastic. And Judy?
And thank you from me, Emma, as well. So I'm Judy Zolkiewski. I'm a professor in marketing at Alliance Manchester Business School, and I've had the pleasure of working with Amir and Ilma, actually both since they first arrived here. So that's how we all know each other.
Fantastic. And I wondered if we could start with a brief overview on the project that you've collaborated together on. I wondered if you wanted to make a start, Amir.
Sure. I think I'm going to give like a background of my PhD study and then moving to the project that we are going to talk more about today. As I said, I started my PhD here at AMBS in 2018. And my PhD study was on designing transformative services, specifically focusing on refugees as kind of people experiencing vulnerability. And then the focus of the project was on understanding how we can better design services to improve the education and employment outcomes for refugees here in the UK. That was the kind of the main research project that I was doing during my PhD. And basically, as a service researcher, my focus was to understand how different components of a service come together to create the best environment for those individuals to have the outcomes and value that they want, being entering the university, entering the college, or having the kind of meaningful employment that they pursued. But it was in between of my kind of study that COVID did happen. I think it was 2020, I think March, April time, that COVID hit. And being a qualitative researcher myself, most of my at that time I was in the middle of my data collection, working in the field, interviewing people, observing individuals, having focus groups, and so on and so forth. And that was the kind of the beginning of the project and research that we are going to talk more about today. I'm not sure if Ilma or Judy would like to add more to that.
Yeah, I think I still remember the time when Amir was like, oh gosh, everything's moved online. What do I do? How do I do my fieldwork? And I think that was the moment we actually started thinking about, okay, how do we take this forward? Because obviously we had no idea when lockdown would end. And Amir was on a specific funded scholarship, so we needed to make sure that he did complete his data collection. And I think that fully aligned with our project. The problems Amir was facing with his qualitative data collection, those were exactly the problems that the vulnerable users like refugees were facing in the real world during the pandemic.
And I guess then what happened, there's always a bit of serendipity in this. But I'm involved in a lot of work about services, mainly, both with Amir and Ilma looking at it in a consumer focus, but also in a B2B focus. And one of the research groups that I work with had got a very large grant which was running, and it was at the time it was all about business services. And when COVID hit, they repurposed some of the money into small grants to investigate digital services in charities.
Oh, wow.
So we had this moment of opportunity, which I think somewhere Amir will find the email that, or I said to him that actually the project saved my life in COVID, because it was something that we were doing that was not to do with everyday running of a university and school, and it was something that was really interesting. So we got a chance to apply. It was only about £5,000. It was a very small amount of money, but it forced us into a network with people we would have never met, which was much more about digital engagement, and it put us in touch with other people working on charities and digitalisation around the country. And of course we had lots of meetings and things online with them and lots of opportunities through that. So we sort of ended up in a position where we got a slightly different route to go down for Amir for collecting some data for his PhD, but it fitted perfectly and it kept us very busy all the way through.
Definitely.
So a challenge kind of actually changed into an
Absolutely.
opportunity, really.
Yeah.
I would just expanding on the point that Judy just mentioned. Before COVID, as a researcher in the field, my challenge was how to capture their experience of vulnerability, and their challenge was experiencing those vulnerabilities. But there was a point in time after COVID that both of us, me as a researcher and them, we had the same challenge of being vulnerable and not having the kind of value out of those digital interactions and online interactions. And I think that was like a turning point in the process of my research and the way that we carried out the remainder of my research until the end of my PhD.
So was that sort of understanding vulnerability, was that was kind of
Absolutely.
there from the start, and that was a kind of contextualizing?
Yes, just to give you some ideas about what was the main challenge for them. So we had these kind of individuals before COVID going to these services run by a charity to improve their language and improve their employability. And during those in-person classes, they had interaction with humans, like face-to-face interactions with teachers, with mentors, with volunteers. And beside learning language and improving their employability, they could have that emotional, social, psychological support as well. But when we moved online and they moved online, although interestingly, the attendance rate increased because probably people were locked down and they didn't have anything else to do, and this was the only way of staying connected to the outside environment. So we had increased number of people coming to each online session, but then at some point we realized, and then they started to share some dissatisfaction with this and saying that, oh, this is not the same course that we had before or before the COVID, or when it was in person. Oh, we don't enjoy and we cannot engage as much as we could before the COVID. So that was the challenge that they were facing. But at the same time, I had interviews with many of these individuals, both practitioners and those using the service before COVID in like face-to-face setting. And although the interview was planned for like 45 minutes, in many occasions we were kind of talking for almost 2 hours without understanding the passage of time. But then inviting them to Zoom interviews, the same individuals, and I was the same interviewer, it was very difficult to go anything beyond 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And I couldn't capture that kind of deep insight, deep experience that I wanted. So I could see what they suffer from in terms of not being able to extract value out of these online interactions. And that was the moment that we decided, now the issue has changed, the challenge has changed from learning language to having social support and psychological support. And that was the moment that we started to see the research problem from a different perspective and changing the focus of our research.
Wow. And do you want to does somebody want to say something about how that research question or that kind of focus changed and what that did for you?
I think the fact that Amir understood that, okay, the human touch is missing here, the interaction part is missing here. And I think when we were discussing, it just came out of the discussion that what do you think, where do you think, what's missing here? And from there, that's where we used strength-based approaches. Because usually when we see what's happening in a research context, we focus on, okay, what's the problem? But we had to flip this around. We had to use appreciative inquiry to ask, what's working well? Because we had so many constraints during the pandemic, limited resources, we couldn't really just say, oh, get in more resources. And as Judy was saying, oh, if we had like 100 laptops, we could just give it all to all our refugee students, but that wasn't a possibility. So we used a strength-based approach and appreciative inquiry to focus on what's working well. And associated theory was the positive deviance theory, because in every community, there are certain parties or people who always do well amidst all the challenges. And we should be focusing on what are they doing differently to overcome those challenges and, create those positive examples. And you learn from them. And our job as researchers is to sort of study that and scale that. So instead of going and saying, what are the gaps? What are the skills gap that refugees might have? For example, lack of confidence, lack of training in using digital technologies. We focused on what they were already doing well. Were they using applications like WhatsApp well? Were they using smartphones already rather than laptops, which wasn't available to many of the refugee students? And then we focused on, okay, so let's build on those and scale that.
And I think, because it's really interesting in terms of, I think we sort of came upon this. I think if retrospectively, when we look back at Amir's data, there's some evidence of differences in delivery across different providers, and that you can see actually that there's a strength-based approach in one of those providers, but we would have never recognised it as such, I don't think, if we hadn't actually had to go through this situation. And there's something else that we sort of, I think we did as part of trying to cope with the little project, was we looked very widely. And I think sometimes when you're normally in the flow of something, I know that I do this, I've got a bit of a tunnel vision. We were, I think people will laugh. I was making Amir and Ilma laugh earlier about saying, there's a model that I always have to have in my research, and I'm not going to name it now. I'm going to leave it out and keep it secret. But I always go back there, and there's so much more to learn from actually saying, okay, yes, that's my comfort place, but I need to look for other places to bring something new in instead of always being the same way around.
And perhaps is that quite helpful working as a three as well? And I think you'd sort of mentioned before, you've all had practitioner backgrounds, so bring kind of different things to the table, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that really helps, because I don't know whether it's a good thing or bad thing with us being academics, because we're always trained to look for theoretical perspectives, focus on a conceptual framework, and then design the research. But with the three of us, we've always just focused on what's happening in the field and focusing on the real world problem first, and then using scholarship and theoretical perspectives to understand that better, rather using an approach of engaged scholarship in that case.
Right. And that's really, I think that sort of moves us on to sort of one of the main things I wanted to sort of talk to you about today, because sort of you've talked about the service users, but also the sort of the charity providers, and I wanted to talk to you a bit about how they were involved, with establishing the problem or the new research problem as it emerged during COVID. What kinds of conversations were going on between you as a team and the people you were working with in that way?
Sure, I can start, and then probably Judy and Ilma can add any point that they would like to. So, before starting my PhD and during my PhD, I was a practitioner working in the charity sector.
Right.
So the area that I was studying and exploring was not that far from my previous experience. I would say I've been exploring something that I've been passionate about for many years, and being a practitioner myself, I knew how to create those connections and relationships with practitioners and have them engaged. But I think during this project, I could see once we started to change our focus from our academic interest to our mutual challenge with the practitioners, I could see the increased level of engagement from them. And at some point, they've become co-researchers. And they started, again, because of the kind of methods that we've employed during the research, and having these focus groups with them and trying to learn from them instead of trying to teach them solutions. I think the level of engagement and their passion has increased significantly, because they could see, yes, these are not just academics coming to collect some data and then disappear. And they had that challenge, that was a genuine interest of them to come up with solutions. And they could see we are not probably lecturing them in terms of, oh, this literature says this and that literature says that. It's about, let's learn together and let's identify the best practices which is feasible for you with the resources that you have, and then let's try to implement them in a wider kind of a scale. And that's, I think that was like a very important point when I think about the success of that small project so far.
And was that there when you went into sort of doing the project, or were you kind of, it's probably difficult to think back now, or were you kind of initially envisaging a more traditional academic approach, or did it just seem natural to you that it would be?
I think, again, coming from that practitioner background, it was natural.
Yeah.
And then I think even thinking about the academic side of it, as academics, we are looking for solutions at least in our field of service research. And that solution should be in relation to the actual problem, not the perceived problem of us. And during that time, that problem has changed. So the problem from how to design the best language course for refugees or the best employability course for refugees has changed to, okay, how we can support them emotionally and psychologically through these online platforms and tools and devices. And if now this is this problem, so as an academic, as a responsible academic, or what we'd later called it, engaged scholar, we need to engage in what is the actual problem of people that we work with, instead of just being fixated with our academic ideas of, oh no, I'm going to follow this research question and this interview got, and so on and so forth. So I would say it was organic, but mainly because of probably understanding what does it take to be a practitioner.
And I guess that's in keeping with the strength-based approach that you sort of said, recognising the strengths of the organisations you're working with rather than seeing them as something outside the. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I can just add something on this strength base and how did it come about. If you go back to most of the reports and literature during COVID, most of them, they identified some challenges, and very few of them, they could come up with some feasible solutions during that time frame. I remember coming to one of our supervisory meetings with a list of, okay, they don't know how to use computers, they don't know how to use Google Doc, they don't know how to do this and how to do that. And that was the time that Ilma mentioned, Judy said, oh, if we had enough money to buy everyone a computer and then a teacher to teach them how to use it, the problem would be solved. But we cannot do that. So how we can come up with a feasible solution that is possible to implement within this time frame, because it's the immediate need. So we cannot go away and come back in 2 years' time with our published paper saying that, oh, 2 years ago you had this problem, now this is the solution. We needed to have like a real-time solution to be kind of implemented considering all the constraints that they had. So we decided, oh, we are going to shift our focus. There are some people out there and they know how to, they have more value out of this compared to others. Let's go and learn from these and then give those learnings some structure and then disseminate it between other users and other practitioners to see if we can solve the issue or not.
Okay. So Amir's mentioned something really interesting there, and I think, I mean, this would have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but the kind of different timelines that we work to as academics versus particularly, say, charities. And I wonder if that was something that, you know, this, I mean, you gave the typical example, this sort of idea of the publication timeline, and that's when we produce our final answer or whatever, but actually working in this sort of time constrained way. I wondered if you wanted to...
I think it's really interesting because as Amir was talking, I was sort of thinking it's a perennial problem, and but having said that, I don't think it's always been there, because there are some, you know, Mintzberg, I think his book was it Mintzberg, that was all out of 2 years working in a company, so that, and observing it and following it, so that he knew exactly what was happening. But I think we far too often take on this consultancy frame in our minds, where we're the experts because we're the academics and we know all these different theories, and somebody comes to us with a problem and we think, oh, well, X theory says this and Y theory says that, without actually stopping to understand what it is that the companies are actually, or companies or organisations are trying to do. And I've done a lot of work with KTPs, knowledge transfer partnerships, and they're very much like that. They've got a problem, and you've got to work with them to solve the problem. And people say, well, why haven't you got a 4-star publication out of a KTP? Well, you're never going to do that, because you're solving a very practical problem. But by doing that, you can start to understand things differently and see it in a different way. And it was really impressed with the fact that services gave this avenue to talk about the strength-based approach that helps you frame with it, or use it, frame your problem with it, or frame your solution with it rather than your problem. So
okay, and so how does that kind of play out in terms of the involvement of the organisation? So you've sort of talked about kind of engaged scholarship and sort of coming up with the research problem together. Like, how does it sort of play out? Because we're kind of mentioning publications and things like that. How involved are the organisations in the kind of full research process, I guess?
I think that during that time, the members of the organization, they were fully involved in the project, because basically what we have done as researchers, we were kind of facilitating these sessions between them as practitioners and as service users, just to share ideas and just to come up with solutions. Just for example, these language teachers, they had issues with students not being able to upload their homeworks to Google Doc. And during one of the sessions, someone said, why it's important to focus on the platform and technology if the purpose is to read the kind of that piece of writing and mark it for that language learner. This could easily be done by just taking a picture and sending that through WhatsApp. And just learning that point from one of the service users themselves. And the point was, whenever I want to send one of my documents to my family back home, this is how I do it. I take a picture and I send it through WhatsApp. So it solved the issue of, oh, we had like 2 homeworks out of 20 students, to the point that we had like 18 homeworks out of 20 students. So, and it was just between them. We didn't do anything but just facilitating these kind of knowledge and experience exchange between them. And for that reason, I would say they were during that time, they were just fully engaged and involved, and we were just learning from them and trying to give our learning some kind of a structure to be kind of more convenient to disseminate.
Yeah, so I think from a academic perspective, we started off with collaborative problem solving. So we didn't start with a problem from theory. We started understanding the problem with the practitioners. Then we also went through a phase of setting up an inclusive research design, where we asked them, okay, what would work for you? What could you implement immediately in your service setting? So it has to be immediately implementable. So it's not a recommendation that we give them after we've got all the findings. So it was all happening in real time. And I think a big part of our project was iterative problem solving all the time. So we would offer a solution based on the strength-based approaches and what we learned from the users and staff who were implementing great solutions already. but we changed it for different settings slightly. So there were English language classes, but at the same time, there were classes which were focused completely on just interaction. So for example, one of the staff members, they started a WhatsApp group about just speaking in another language, in Arabic, for example, and it was just about engaging with their students and setting up those, giving them the opportunity during the pandemic to network and, enhance their personal relationships. So it wasn't actually related to English language education, but it enhanced the English language education.
So I guess it's like an inclusive research design that is also quite flexible.
Absolutely.
Rather than, and I wondered how that fits with, just even thinking about ethics applications and things like that, where you have to lay down all your sort of plans. Am I asking you about a complete minefield? Because it sounds like you had to make quite a few adaptations to what.
I think I start with that point about flexibility of research methods, and then probably on point of ethics, Judy and Ilma can add. I think that was important, especially being qualitative researchers. Most of the time, sometimes, the way that we collect data is disrupting the kind of the workflow of the organization or those practitioners. So one thing that we were kind of successful in doing was coming up with some data collection procedures and practices that wasn't kind of against the process of their work, and we were not being there disrupting the normal process of their work. It was just observing and facilitating and listening and mainly learning from them than trying to kind of take extra time out of them, interviewing them or giving like advice to them or having like some lecture sessions or workshop sessions for them. I think that point of flexibility was important when it comes to methods, for them to see the space and then the passion to engage in our work, and then making the whole project possible.
I think with regards to ethics, so Amir already had a really detailed ethics application ready for his PhD, which covered participatory methods, like focus groups and those workshops, interviewing, semi-structured interviewing, more open-ended interviewing, and observation as well. So because we had such a detailed ethics application covering all those areas for vulnerable users, we were okay for this project in the sense that we didn't deviate at all from the main questions we were focusing on, but we were actually doing iterative problem solving in the way that, okay, so if this is the problem, then shall we ask this question next? But I think the main areas were covered, and as you know, the University of Manchester ethics application process is really they've got stringent requirements. So we had gone through all those hoops beforehand. I think in a sense, we didn't change any of the main questions that we had for our interviews or focus groups and the setting that we had in mind for observation, but it's just our approach and focus on strengths rather than skills gaps, rather than the problems just changed.
Yeah, it's interesting though, isn't it, how we kind of sort of work as academics and how things kind of change once you're in the field and kind of actually.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really interesting because I've had with one of my other colleagues, we had a very interesting ethics process last year. It took us about 7 months to get approval. And it was because we'd gone for a very flexible, we're going to do some interviews, we're going to do some observation, we're going to do, we were talking about doing a Delphi study as well. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that we had somebody who was very quantitative reviewing it. And we said, we're going to go to companies and we'll do some observation while we were there. And they said, but you can't do that because you've not got permission. How are you going to have permission to observe it? So it took us a long time to write a proposal that was flexible enough to allow us to do what we wanted to do. But it gives you then the flexibility to be able to incorporate more things in it, as opposed to I've done my ethics approval for a questionnaire that's got 5 subsections and 70 questions that you just can't vary from. So you put your investment in up front and get it to a point where I think it can work.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that sort of how you attend to not only the big challenges like, say, a global pandemic, but actually sort of going into the field and sort of realising that actually things aren't quite how you thought they were, or perhaps kind of, you know, sort of using a different kind of approach. So on from that kind of this sort of whole idea of the kinds of participatory methods and things like that, what kind of advice would you give, like in terms of sort of approaches for other kind of teams going into similar kinds of settings? I know you've sort of mentioned strength-based approaches. What are the kind of different aspects to your approach that you would really like to emphasize?
I think that this is the subject of one of the papers that we are working at the moment on, just trying
that's fortuitous.
just trying to kind of document our learnings from this particular project, to kind of to share with the rest of colleagues, at least within kind of the business research area. I would start with that problem formulation. I think that was the key to success. Without that alignment of, okay, we have the same challenge as you, and whatever solution that we come up with, it's going to solve the issue of both of us. I think that collaborative problem formulation is significantly important for research process to end up with positive results for academics, or outcomes for academics in terms of papers and the rest of outcomes, as well as creating solutions for the kind of the areas that we study, the companies, the not-for-profits, or for those individuals that we study or explore during our research. I think that's the first step that we mention in our framework as well. I'm not sure if Judy and Ilma would like to go through the rest of the steps.
Yeah, I mean, I think we came up with the term because we could see and in real time the social impact that our project was having, and I hope it's still, you know, the charity is still reaping the benefits of all those solutions that we came up with. I think we came up with the term business research as service for social impact, a very academic term, I guess, but essentially it's about applying engaged scholarship principles to this kind of collaborative project. So I think the first step, as Amir has highlighted, is collaborative problem formulation. And the second step, we said, okay, trying to use a strength-based approach rather than a deficit-based approach where we focus on gaps. We focused on the strengths, possibilities, and what is already being done well. I think the third element is inclusive research design, making sure we take into account not just the practitioners' perspectives, but the service settings that they deliver the service in, because the solutions have to be easily implementable immediately. Otherwise, they won't be waiting like a few months to implement it, because they need immediate results and immediate solutions. And finally, I think the other step, which is really important, is iterative problem solving, all the time reviewing. So I wouldn't recommend researchers doing these collaborative projects to wait a few weeks to review. I would suggest every week they should review and sit with practitioners and even users wherever possible to make sure that whatever they're recommending and whatever is being implemented is reviewed, and then we can learn from that and then scale that further across the organization.
So it's basically quite a high involved kind of, it's not a sort of parachute in, get the data out kind of, it's a sort of, as you say, an iterative
and
process.
It's a relational process, I think, as well. And I think it's one of those things that as trust grows, it develops more. And I think the thing that I'd add, and we've talked about it a lot, but it's also being really reflexive as a researcher. So you've got to think about all the time your impact on the people that you've interviewed, the organisations that you're interacting with, actually how it impacts the team that are working on it, And there's a huge amount of reflexivity, if I guess I can say it, that comes into that, but informs your thinking and makes you as well trying to open your mind out. Because I think one of the things that was nice about this was that we really had to think outside the box. We couldn't go where we would go to our we couldn't go to my little happy place. Had to think about a different way of looking at it and searching for different ways of seeing things. And I think that that's really helpful because it opens up lots of different avenues for you to think about and hopefully find success out of.
It's almost like the journey itself is rather than just the destination.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, basically, that engaged scholarship as an academic framework, it was just very recently that we started to use that term and that framework to kind of to structure our learnings and develop our paper. But the reason that resonated with me was engaged in the literal meaning of the word. Because we engaged and they engaged, all of us. It wasn't about us and them at some point. It was about we had the same issue and we had genuine interest and involvement in finding a solution to solve that issue and keep the service going. I think that's the origin of engaged scholarship and how it entered our study.
Right, fantastic. And that seems a good point to kind of talk about your workshop actually that you did for us at Methods at Manchester, because we're really keen to engage with different organisations, particularly sort of smaller and social impact organisations outside academia in terms of developing knowledge of research methods. And so the three of you very kindly came in and delivered a workshop for us. So I wondered if you could sort of tell us a little bit about that and how that went for you. I don't know who wants to start.
I think again the workshop itself was part of that, being kind of an engaged scholar. And then Ilma, I think at some point in the beginning, Ilma mentioned about social impact and the way and the definition of social impact that we've been following in our work and in our studies was it's about disseminating and exchanging knowledge, but that's not the end of it. The end point is creating improvement in some social outcomes. And then I think all those efforts in having the toolkit that we've been working on and then having these kind of workshops with practitioners was part of our interest and our sort of mission to facilitate that social impact and those improvements in the work and in the life of individuals. And I think the workshop was a very good opportunity for us to, first of all, to show our work and the toolkit that we've developed for online service delivery when it comes to vulnerable individuals, but beyond that to show to practitioners from the charity sector how fruitful engaging with academics could be for them. Because again, often it's about parachuting, taking the data that you want and then disappearing, which creates some sense of not trusting academics in some particular settings. But then one point, at least for me, being a practitioner myself, was to show these collaborations, if done properly, could be fruitful for both sides. It's not just about academics having what they want, but the other parties can achieve the value that they expect from these collaborations.
I think for me, the interesting part was what I learned from them as well. So we did share our findings. We did cross-validate our findings, and that helped in writing a paper later. But I think I learned that their problems are quite simple from an academic perspective, because they asked me questions like, because we discussed how we collected qualitative data, how we analyzed it, and how we shared it with practitioners. And they were like, how did you convince top management about what to do? How did you show that without quantitative data, they could actually rely on qualitative data and use that for strategy development? And we've had those conversations about rigor in qualitative research, many different times. But all I had to tell them is that, look, you need to bring out those participant comments and quotes a bit more. Show them the richness of the perspectives and the diversity of perspectives, which helps you understand not just one type of users, but different types of stakeholders involved. And then they were like, oh, right, yeah, that's a good way to sort of present that to top management and sort of convince them through qualitative data. So I think I took a lot away from that workshop about highlighting the simple but really important things that they can apply immediately in the real world.
And possibly the importance of talking about your research and different approaches, because I should imagine that's another issue for a lot of smaller organisations and particularly charities, is that they're often working in their own corners on very real life problems and not necessarily having the time and the space to actually engage with other people, whether academics, whether other charity sector people. So,
and on that point of, before we go to Judy, on that point of the issues of having top management involved, although today we cannot name the charity that we work with for data protection purposes, but we had the support of the top management. They even wrote a letter in support of our grant application, because again they could see the value of that kind of participation and engaging in our research.
Because you'd involved them from the start,
absolutely.
So they were on side. It was their project as much as it was your project, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, they could see the outcomes from it. You know, I think there's nothing sort of beats the fact that actually it helped solve some really difficult problems for them, which I think was really, really helpful. I mean, I've been sat here thinking about this, and this is a little bit AMBS focused, but one of the challenges I think for business schools has always been this notion of how you actually really help businesses, because it's actually, if a business comes to you, it's a single business problem, not a whole set of businesses with necessarily the same problems. So how do you go about doing research that is valuable for them and for you? And I think quite often it gets put aside and just treated as consultancy. But if you just go and do consultancy, you're just parachuting in and you're not there to see the consequences or the outcomes or anything like that. So actually having a way that we can encourage a wider academic environment that allows this or accepts that not all data has got to be highly quantitative to be meaningful, that actually there's other things that are just as useful and helpful, I think is really something we have to keep on working at and arguing for.
I agree with Judy, and I think she's highlighted something really important. It does take time. It's not structured. With a quantitative design, you have an idea about what data you're going to collect, and then you get that and you start doing analysis, you start writing up. But it wasn't the case in this project, and it wouldn't be in other collaborative engaged scholarship projects. It will take time, and there'll be lack of structure, a lot of improvisation in the midst of the project. And I think because we weren't really focusing on the publication aspect, it sort of freed us. We were working with them, interacting with them, they were engaged, we were engaged, and we were able to sort of come up with a collaborative solution and apply it immediately. And then now we're focusing on publications. So.
Excellent. I was gonna actually ask you where next with this work, but is that it? The publications, they still have to come.
Yeah, I guess that's on our priority list, but I think we are definitely continuing to work on this a little bit further. Amir can comment on our next steps a little bit more.
Well, I think that area is something that is my research interest. I've been kind of continuing my research in the same kind of area of research beyond my PhD. But I think one point that I can see out of that project is it opened some new opportunities for publication as well. So at the moment we have, I think, 2 or 3 papers, or 2 papers probably out of that project under review.
Well done.
One, the empirical findings of the actual project, which was part of my PhD, but the whole conversation that we've had today, it opened some opportunities for us to write a method paper in terms of how to change or what kind of research design can improve the social impact and social outcome of the research. So out of that project, empirical paper, and then the method paper was the kind of opportunity that we've had as a result of being more flexible, being more solution oriented during this particular project. I think that's my point on that.
And without giving too much away, we've just been discussing this morning about another project we can sort of start writing about applying strength-based approaches in other fields. And that's something that's on the horizon as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we will keep our listeners updated on any publications that are connected to the project. So I'd like to thank the three of you for coming along today. It's been absolutely fantastic hearing about your experiences and the relationships you've developed that seem to be sort of enduring, which is really fantastic to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.